affordable norms and standards that we try to impose at India's income levels, whether it is a FAR or whether it is how much back spaces you should leave without construction. All these are being talked about when we deal with urban issues. And they say reliance on subsidies and grants and tax rebates. They said, look, these lead to overconsumption and the failure to internalize cost and continuing to rely on these. These are all the kinds of different arguments which are put out in different fora whenever issues of sustainability are discussed. That really brings me to the second part of the lecture, which is really the policy issue. What is it? What kind of a policies? How have we translated these concerns? Or what are the kinds of postulates that we have had when we were dealing with policies, dealing with urbanization and urban development? If you look at the 5-year plans, even as late as the 9th 5-year plan, certainly the 8th one, but even if you go to that, up to that point, somehow we thought that we could make urbanization much more acceptable if we slow down the pace of urbanization. They thought this 2.5, 2.6, 2.7% was much too high for India's income levels. We should slow down. There was undertone, even very strong undertones up to the 8th 5-year plan, that urbanization is bad. It's the rural part which really would provide India's future growth. That's the undercurrent in the 5-year plan documents. Large cities are bad. Focus on small cities. Change the city size distribution in favor of small and medium towns. And therefore, you will find a program such as the integrated development of small and medium towns having been taken up in 1970s. Large cities are bad. Let's focus our attention on small and medium-sized cities. Develop them as counter-magnets, develop them as on their own merit, but that is what you do. And continue with subsidies and tax rebates for service and infrastructure. He said, after all, the poor have to have water, the poor have to have services. Continue with those subsidies. You will find use administrative prices. So whether there is a relationship between cost and the price is irrelevant. You must subsidize services, otherwise poor would be without basic services. And continue with, and the last one being very important, and I think Sundar was probably one of the most ardent advocate of that. I'm talking of 1970s. They continue with the public provision, public financing, and public management of urban infrastructure. That is where the wisdom lies. Let the public sector play a bigger role, a direct role in public provision, in public financing, and public management of infrastructure. Vinod would recall the 1976, which was the first global habitat conference in Vancouver. That was the first one, where issues of similar kinds were being raised. Some of us who attended that conference came out with the impression that we have found the solution. The public sector is important. Public sector will provide services. It has the capacity, it has the money, and it has the management to deal with them. That's the kind of a philosophy around which our policies of the 70s and early 80s were drafted. So you see the plan documents, you will not find anywhere even a mention of word private sector at all. You will not find that in urban development context, you will not find that happening. And that is what we did, precisely. So we had direct intervention in urban development, And our direct intervention was changing the city size distribution. Large cities, forget the large cities, let's focus our attention on small cities. Continue giving subsidies, that is how our administrative pricing system in respect of water and in respect of others. Bus transport, that is how it was drafted. And the direct role of public provision, forget this one. It began to change. It continued, it lasted until 1990 or 1991, and it began to change only in 1992, parallel with what everyone knows, the economic reforms. Until then, these policies continued. There was no change at all for the 20 years, 1970 to 1990. These policies were really dominant in our thinking. That is how it is. Other countries realized it slightly sooner, that look, this kind of a framework of urban policy. It was the same all over. I'm not saying that only India followed this. In fact, if you see the World Monitoring, Urban Population Monitoring reports, almost every country had exactly the same policies. Let's focus attention on small cities. Let's continue providing subsidy to the poor, and direct subsidies to the poor. In all the environmental improvement of slums, the SEPA programs, self-employment programs to the urban poor, somewhat similar programs were initiated in almost every country. Direct subsidies for the poor, change the city size distributions. Other countries started realizing that it's not delivering. This kind of a policy framework is not delivering at all. Our realization came in 1992 when we began an appraisal of urban policies in a much more serious fashion. I don't think Sundar was there in that meeting when Dr. Chalaya, soon after his report on tax reforms, he came out with a very strong statement in the meeting that cities are important for economic growth. You would not find that statement anywhere in the Planning Commission until the 9th five-year plan. That was the first statement he made. Cities are important to economic growth. They are central to growth. And subsequently, more recently, it has been added that not only for cities are important, not only for growth, but also for poverty reduction. A dramatic change in the way our both policy frameworks and thinking began to sort of shift in favor of cities. And when I mention cities, really cities refer to, in census terminology, census city is 1 lakh plus settlements. But we also use generically, city means an urban settlement, but more in census definition. Since then, the whole thinking about cities have been changing. With every five-year plan, we make a stronger statement that cities are really unavoidable, so much so that in one of the meetings it was said that if anything were to happen today to cities like Delhi, Mumbai, Calcutta, Chennai, Ahmedabad, Hyderabad, Bangalore, the country would begin to collapse. So much more stronger statements have been coming over the past 15, 20 years that, look, let's not ignore our cities. They are the harbingers of growth. That is where much of our GDP comes from. And let us focus our attention much more directly on what cities can do to further accelerate the economy. In fact, many people have argued there's 9%, 8% growth rate that we have had in the country. Much of it, if one does the very careful calculation, much of it would be attributed to large cities. And it is this that brings me to the last part of the session, that in what way is this thinking that cities are important to growth, cities are important for poverty reduction, how does it reflect now in our urban policy frameworks and urban policy programs? How does that, where is that reflected? Sundar, I can't avoid bringing in this one and discuss it, that what are the principles and postulates on which it is based, and will it lead to sustainable urbanization? This is one program some of us have been working on over the past 7 years now. It began in 2005, and this is the main program that really reflects both the policy framework. If you begin to translate it, you will find that it is a very strong policy overtones. And the program in the question obviously leads us whether this is in any way contributing to sustainability, or whether it will also create the kinds of problems that we were talking about: reduction of poverty, depletion of resources, and so on and so forth. See, to give you a little bit of historical background, right from 2003, 2004 onwards, a very serious debate on whether our initiatives that had been taken to look at urbanization, whether they were adequate or whether they needed some kind of a change, both within the government as well as outside the government. Outside the government really meant what was happening outside India, one, and whether there were any examples coming from institutions such as the World Bank as to how the World Bank was responding to developing countries' requests for urban development. What was the focus in those interventions that the World Bank was using in other countries? That one, how other countries were formulating their policies, and then in-house, within the country, domestic sort of evaluations and appraisals. How was that being done? A more serious analysis showed that there were huge impediments to sustainable urbanization. It was happening. We were being overtaken by urbanization. It was happening all the time, and the figures show it. But then, whether it was really desirable, or whether it was creating additional distortions, disconnects within the economy, those kinds of issues were coming up in our day-to-day discussions. And when we sat down, we discovered 4 or 5 things of utmost importance to us. What does the city need? City needs land and services and a management structure. Simply look, how does the city run? It requires land. It requires infrastructure and services, which would include water and so on and so forth, solid waste, sewerage systems, mobility patterns, and so on. And number 3, it requires a governance structure. The analysis that we started doing was, let's look at these 3 and see whether there was enough flow of land into cities for meeting the requirements of 9 to 10 million people that get added every year to urban population. 1, whether infrastructure and services were also increasing in the same quantity as this additional population needed. 2, and whether the governance of cities, how it is administered, how it is financed, whether these were adequate for meeting this onrush of 9 to 10 million people every year. Really see these 3 things. After all, that is what the city needs: land, infrastructure, services, and a governance structure. And we found that nothing was working. The land market was not functioning. And when I use the word land market, it just meant that if you want to go and buy land, or if you want to sell land, you can't do it. You have to use underhand. There's no way in which anyone can buy land or sell land without entering into some kind of an agreement with either the purchaser or the seller for doing some activity which is underhand. It's not, land market doesn't function. You can't go and buy it. like any other tomatoes and onions, land or housing. It was not functioning. Found with infrastructure and services. Was there enough investment in infrastructure and services? After all, in pure economics, if there's a demand, supply will respond. Now here was a huge demand, there was a huge deficit, and yet the investments were not there. Nobody would invest. Neither the public sector, which had taken upon itself the responsibility of investing into it, or the private sector. It was not there. Or the governance. You just want your birth certificate? It's not there unless you know someone. Or you stand in queues for 7 days and then you get one birth certificate. Nothing was functioning. We started looking at the laws which govern these three sectors. The land market is, how is it determined? The laws which deal with land were the Land Acquisition Act of 1894. There was the Land Sealing and Regulation Act of 1976. There was old laws of Registration Act of, it was what, 1824 or? Or Transfer of Property Act. These were all done in the 19th century, all these acts. Or the Stamp Duty of 1899. When we started looking as to what affects land market, what is the legal structure that really governs our land market? After all, when you're buying and selling, and if it is a legal document, then there's some law that supports it. And we found that either they were obsolete or they were impeding land from coming into the market without some underhand dealings. That was our first breakthrough in our analysis, whether land market can ever function in India without either making amendments to those acts or whether doing away with them, whether they were serving any function or whether you have to amend them or do away with them. Or take the example of rent controls. I do not know whether any of you have ever come across rent controls. Cannot place in Delhi. Cannot place is under rent control, which means that the tenants in cannot place shops are paying 10 rupees, 15 rupees, 20 rupees rent per month for a shop in cannot place. If you go to old city area, it's the same situation. Tenants are paying 5 rupees rent even today. My sister used to live until 3 years back. She was paying 5 rupees for a 3-bedroom in Nai Sadak area. Those who know Delhi would know that. 5 rupees, and for 75 years they had been living there. 5 rupees rent. Finally, some wisdom prevailed on them and they left and they took another house somewhere else. But that is the rent control. And rent control had come in India at the time of the First World War, and it was reimposed in the Second World War under the Defense of India Act. So there was no renewal. I mean, if you are paying 5 rupees rent or 15 rupees or even if it is 100 rupees rent in cannot place, why would the landlord, or what would be the incentive with the landlord to make any improvement in that shop? So huge areas in Delhi, huge areas in Mumbai, Marine Drive in Mumbai. In fact, 1/3 of Mumbai is under rent control even today. And therefore, some of the beautiful buildings in Mumbai, they are all collapsing. There is no incentive for anyone to make any improvement in the structure. So the urban renewal process, which is an important part of any urban development in any country, doesn't take place in India. So what do? Either you have two choices. Either you let the building collapse, which happens every year. Some buildings do collapse every year. And then people move out and so on and so forth. Or you bring in a program of how to do away with rent control. What are the vested interests in keeping rent control? And if one has to renew its city, and every city has a life, 30 years for all of us. After 30, 40 years, the city building does require some kind of, it's not taking place. So there was a whole process of looking at these regulations, acts, systems, procedures, which ran for almost a year, examining each one. What is really impeding it? Then we started looking at, so why does the infrastructure doesn't flow into these sectors? There's a huge demand. If there's huge demand, supply should respond. No, because you had fixed the tariff at a level where no one is willing to invest. I do not know how many of you really belong to Delhi, but if you were in Delhi 3 years back, or 3 or 4 years back, our water rate in Delhi was 35 paisa per 1,000 liters. Now it has increased. After it was taken over the DJB and little bit of pressures, now it has increased. But earlier it was 35 per 1 cubic meter or 1,000 liters. Now, if the water is 35 liters per 1,000 liters, why would anyone invest in it? It is bound to run into losses. Bound to run into losses. There is no, and you can't continue with subsidies for an indefinite period. So that was the second aspect, that why is it that notwithstanding a huge demand, no one ever spends? And it was, even for the public sector, you invest in it and you accumulate more losses because you are still selling water at 35 paisa. Or similarly, our DTC buses in Delhi, the kind of fare structures that Delhi has, there was no way in which the DTC could make profits, apart from mismanagement. We're leaving that issue aside for the time being. So we looked at this aspect and we said something. If urban is an attractive proposition, and if there are compelling reasons to improve services, at this level India cannot become competitive in the global market, then something needs to be done about it. The second. Then we started looking at the governance structures, municipal corporations, urban parastatal agencies, which are really responsible for infrastructure and services. I do not know how many of you have really gone to a municipal office, ever. Sundar must have gone, no? No, you have, I see. We always sort of joke among ourselves that if there are two places where no respectable citizen would want to go, one is a police station, and second is a municipal office. One would want to avoid these two. In any case, no respectable person would want to go there.
So what's the ballpark figure of the subsidy given by the government to run a city like Delhi?
Oh, Delhi is a spoiled city. Delhi is a spoiled city.
I'm asking, what is the level of subsidy?
I mean, some JNU people had made an estimate, and they said 7,000 crore. That was about 5-6 years back.
Per person?
Yeah.
How much would that be?
Per person, but Delhi has 1.2 crore. Simple, about 5,000-6,000 rupees per person. Delhi is a spoiled city. Delhi is not a normal city in that respect. That's an underestimate. No, that was done about 6-7 years back by JNU. Some students did that.
That's why I'm asking, is it worth sustaining a city like Delhi at this cost of subsidy?
No, but why not you ask the other question? That why not we, all of us, pay
Yes.
the market price and run the city in a much better way than we are doing now? I mean, if we have to live on subsidies, then we have to suffer this. You continue with for some time, but you can't continue indefinitely. You're absolutely correct. Such cities cannot be sustained. Look at Chandigarh, built with such fan and fair, but it's a highly subsidized city. But they maintain a good level of service. And it's a union territory. It's subsidized by the Ministry of Home Affairs. I don't know what is the subsidy for that one. But I can tell you that the municipal corporation of Chandigarh is not able to meet from its own resources more than 10% of its expenditure. 90% comes as a subsidy from the union government to Chandigarh. Delhi Municipal Corporation, now of course the state government has taken over DJB and transport and so on and so forth. We started looking at this countrywide, not just Delhi. In fact, Delhi was the last place that we looked at. We said, let's look at a normal city, not Delhi.
Sir, is there a study these subsidies have led to a concentration of population from rural to urban areas, or the increase, great disparity in the wage rates which people labor get, that leads to migration from rural to these cities. If there is a study on these two, sir, can you...
There are a number of studies on subsidies per se, but not linking subsidies to migration. A person migrating from a rural area to an urban area will not look at the price at which water is available in Delhi. He would be much more concerned whether he will get a job in Delhi or not, whether he will get someplace to squat to begin with. The other things come later. Let me tell you, if you go to Govindpuri, one of the largest slums in Delhi, the survival strategies are very important. They have contracted parts of Govindpuri to private water suppliers. And what the private water suppliers have done is that they've dug up tube wells. They are running regular pipelines and not synthetic. They have laid out a proper pipeline to the residences of the slum dwellers. Each resident has been given a syntax of 500 liters. Every day that syntax 500 liters are filled up, and they charge 180 rupees per month. That's it. It functions very well.
Vasant Kunj was also running on these tankers for...
Yeah, but those tankers were largely from the DJP. Vasant Kunj was running on that one. I know our colleagues used to live there, and they were saying, you were not. But he's a private enterprise, and he makes money. And everyone seems to be happy. He gets assured water, 500 liters a day, for 180 rupees a month, and supplier is happy because he makes a profit out of it.
That's a subsidy together with the job availability as well as higher wage rates. These three are coupled.
You're right. He comes for wage rate, he comes for livelihood. Maybe somewhere, or he would probably think whether he could make a jhuggi somewhere or the other. And in any case, water being what it is, can't be denied. Supreme Court orders being that water must be supplied to everyone. You can't deny it, whether a person is able to pay or not, but these are the Supreme Court sort of orders, both in respect of this, as well as in respect of solid waste must be collected. In 2000 rules, the judgment of the Supreme Court is very much there.
Now that we have Manrega in place, and it's running quite well, is it having an impact on this migration? Is it stopping this tendency to move?
If you take the 2001-2011 census, then no. Migration, the share of migration has risen. In urban population growth during the decade of 2001-2011, the share of migration has risen. But share could rise also because the share of natural growth rate has declined. So that's not really a very correct kind of an interpretation of the facts. But there is no let-up. In any case, it was not huge migration. Our migration rate is not as large as it is in many other countries, but migration, there's no let-up because of NREGA. But NREGA has created instability in the labor market. Delhi, just to give you